I'm working on a pattern right now that needs 8 4-patch units. This is my 4-patch here. And what the pattern tells me to do is to cut out 16 squares of each color. Obviously, these are a different color. So it tells me to cut out 16 1 3/4 inch squares of my background and of my main color. These are just 2 color 4-patches. So I could do that and sew them together one pair at a time, or I can strip piece. So rather than cutting out 32 1 3/4 inch squares, I cut a 1 3/4 inch strip of my background fabric, and I happen to be working with fat quarters for my print fabrics, and 1 3/4 times 16 comes out to 28, so I want a little bit longer than a 28 inch strip. My background's just width of fabric, that's fine. But since I'm working from fat quarters, I have one strip from the fat quarter and then another partial from the fat quarter. I'm going to take these strips and sew them together along the long edge using an accurate 1/4 inch seam. And when I get to the end of this one that's on the fat quarter, I'm just going to stick another one on there in the sewing machine. That's fine, I will just trim that off later. You could cut your background strips to the same size. Here's my strip or strips sewn together, and there's the gap I mentioned I'd have. I'm just going to cut around it when I get there. So this strip, because I cut my individual strips 1 3/4 inches wide, should now be 3 inches. And if I put my ruler down on it, it is. That's going to be important. So the first thing I'm going to do here is cut off my selvage edge. So I'm cleaning up that edge. I'm putting a line on my seam in the center. I'm also putting lines on my cut edges. And I'm going to cut that off. Now, I like to work with my ruler, cutting a big section and then backing the ruler off. And the reason I do that is because my cuts are then more accurate. Because if I keep cutting on this, if I cut a piece off, then I have to stop, move it out of the way, position my ruler again, cut, move it out of the way, and eventually my cut edge starts getting crooked. So if I'm always moving backwards, and let me show you what I mean, I'm cutting 1 3/4 inch strips off of this, and because I'm working on a smaller surface for the camera and with a shorter ruler, I'm going to start by cutting a 10.5 inch piece off. So I'm lining up my lines on the ruler again with that center seam and also with my cut edges top and bottom, and then down on my short end that I already cleaned up, I'm lining up my 10.5 inch mark. So I know that edge is straight, and I'm going to cut. And then I'm going to back the ruler up 1 3/4 inches, so that would be 8 3/4. So I'm going to just back the ruler up to the 8 3/4 mark. Again, I'm lining up the 8 3/4 on the short edge. I'm keeping a line lined up with the seam in the center and lines with my cut edges top and bottom. I've got my 8 3/4. I'm going to cut. Then I'm going to move back another 1 3/4 inches. So this time that would make it 7 inches. And I'm always lining up with my seams and my top and bottom cut edges, so I keep everything straight and cut. And notice I'm always measuring off this end that I know is straight. I'm not cutting and then measuring from the cut end, so everything stays straight. I also don't have to stop and pick this up and move it out of the way to go to my next measurement. So I'm going to back it up another 1 3/4 inches. And I do want to point out, it doesn't matter which lines you have lined up on the long edges now. It's just to keep it straight. So 5 1/4 and cut. And I can do this in my head when I'm doing 2 1/2 or 1 1/2, 1 3/4, and I made a list. So that was 5 1/4. I'm going to back up to 3 1/2. And it doesn't look like it's that much faster when I'm talking on the video, but it really is when you're centered over your work. And then I'm going to back up to the 1 3/4. And I'm just going to keep doing this until I have my 16 2-patch units. So with that one I have 6, and I'll keep going off camera. So remember when I was putting my strips together, I just butted up my second piece from the fat quarter when I was sewing it. So when I get to that point and can't get another square out of it, I'm just going to go ahead and line everything up and square off, and that piece is scrap, and then I will keep going just like I did before. So now I've cut all 16 1 3/4 inch sections out of my long strip. So now it's time to put these 16 sections together into 8 4-patches. All I need to do is rotate so they're going diagonal from each other. My seams are going the opposite direction because it was all pressed toward the dark, so my seams will nest, and I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch on the edge. I've sewn all 8 4-patches, and I do want to point out that I chain piece, so I put one piece right after the other into the sewing machine. I do not cut threads in between. This helps me be a little more accurate, and it's also faster, and it uses less thread. So now I can cut them apart, and I want to show you, you could just press to one side if you want to. This is what I like to do. I like to pop those seams, and they will only pop one direction. I'm popping, this is the last seam I sewed, so this is the first one. I am twisting on the last seam that I sewed. If I twist one way, it does absolutely nothing. If I twist the other way, then a couple little stitches pop out there in the intersection, and now I can press it in a pinwheel shape. And the reason you might want to do that is because it gives a flatter intersection in the middle. So here's one that I actually already pressed. You might not want to do it if the seams need to go a certain way to interlock with something else. On this one, it's not going to be important. So again, let me show you another pop. If your stitch length is too short, or if you back stitch, which I do not recommend when you're quilting most of the time, at the beginning or end of your seam, this won't work. So if I twist this way, nothing happens. If I twist the other way, a couple stitches pop out, and because I'm making a 4-patch, I get a little tiny 4-patch there in the middle. So I have all 8 of my 4-patches sewn together, and it was much quicker than if I had handled 32 individual squares. Now, if you like doing the individual ones, that's fine. As long as I can be fast and accurate, I am all for that because there's so many quilts and so little time.